Keanu Reeves was just browsing through a flea market in Los Angeles, trying to enjoy a quiet morning away from Hollywood's chaos, until something unusual caught his eye. Amidst old records and dusty antiques, an elderly man sat at a small table, carefully laying out military medals as if they were just any other trinket for sale. The glint of those medals in the sunlight stopped Keanu in his tracks. Why would anyone part with such priceless symbols of courage and sacrifice? Curiosity pulled him closer, but what Keanu discovered wasn't just one man's heartbreaking story. It was a glimpse into a silent crisis affecting thousands of veterans across the country. And what he did next? It would not only change the old man's life, but spark a movement no one saw coming. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. It was a crisp Saturday morning in Los Angeles, and the city buzzed with its usual chaotic energy. The sun cast long, golden rays over the sprawling Rose Bowl flea market, where hundreds of stalls stretched out like a colorful maze. Vendors shouted out their best deals, children tugged at their parents' sleeves, and the air was thick with the mingled scents of fresh coffee, vintage leather, and street food. Among the crowd, blending in with his unassuming attire, walked Keanu Reeves. Dressed in a simple flannel shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed boots, he carried a small canvas bag over his shoulder, moving at a leisurely pace, enjoying the quiet anonymity that the market offered. Keanu loved mornings like this. Away from the flashing cameras and the rigid schedules of Hollywood, he found peace in the ordinary. Chatting with little artisans, flipping through crates of old vinyl records, and discovering forgotten relics from the past. But as he turned a corner near the back of the market, something unusual caught his eye. There, at a modest stall tucked between a vintage book vendor and a seller of old postcards, stood an elderly man. His back was slightly hunched, his face weathered with deep lines that spoke of a lifetime of stories. But it wasn't the man's appearance that made Keanu pause. It was what he was selling. Laid out carefully on a threadbare cloth were several gleaming military medals, each one polished to perfection. Alongside them were faded black and white photographs, a young man in uniform, standing tall and proud, a group of soldiers laughing in the barracks, a snapshot of what looked like a family, the edges frayed with time. The medals shimmered under the morning sun, their significance impossible to ignore. Keanu's heart tightened. He knew the value of such items wasn't in the medal or the ribbons. It was in the memories they carried, the sacrifices they represented. What kind of desperation would drive a man to part with pieces of his own history? Compelled by an invisible force, Keanu approached the stall. The old man, lost in thought, barely noticed as Keanu picked up one of the medals, turning it gently in his hand. The inscription read, "For valor and bravery." "It's beautiful," Keanu said softly, his voice gentle but curious. The old man looked up, his pale blue eyes clouded with something between pride and sorrow. "They were," the man replied, his voice rough like gravel but steady. "Now, they're just things. Can't eat memories, you know." Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard stories of veterans struggling to make ends meet, but seeing it firsthand was different. He looked back at the man, sensing there was more to the story than just financial hardship. "May I ask, why are you selling them?" Keanu ventured, his eyes searching the man's face for answers. The old man hesitated, his fingers brushing over a photograph of his younger self in uniform. For a moment, it seemed like he might brush off the question, but then something in Keanu's sincere gaze made him open up. "I don't have much of a choice," the man finally said, his voice quieter now. "The pension doesn't cover half of what it used to. Medical bills are piling up and, well, it's just me now. No one left to care if these stay with me or not." Keanu felt his heart break a little. This wasn't just about medals. This was about survival, about dignity, about the silent struggles that people like this man endured every day without anyone noticing. As Keanu stood there, the bustling noise of the market seemed to fade into the background. The weight of the moment settled over him, and he knew he couldn't just walk away. But what he would do next would not only change the old man's life, it would ripple far beyond this small flea market, touching hearts across the city and inspiring a movement that no one could have predicted. Keanu gently placed the medal back on the table, his fingers lingering on its cool surface for a moment longer. The old man's words echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him, a mix of sorrow, anger, and a profound sense of responsibility. "I'm Keanu," he said softly, extending his hand. The old man looked at him for a brief moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place the face. But recognition didn't spark. To him, Keanu was just another stranger in a world that had long since forgotten him. After a pause, he reached out, shaking Keanu's hand with a firm grip that belied his frail appearance. "George," the man replied simply. "George?" Keanu repeated, the name tasting heavy on his tongue. "Would you mind if I asked a bit more about these medals? They seem like they've seen some incredible moments." George let out a dry chuckle, a sound that was more bitter than amused. He sank into a rickety folding chair behind the table, his gaze drifting to the medals as if seeing them anew. "Incredible moments," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's one way to put it." Keanu remained silent, sensing that George needed space to find his words. The market noise continued around them. Vendors haggling, children laughing, the distant hum of a street musician's guitar. But at that moment, it felt like the two of them were in a bubble, disconnected from the world. "I was just a kid when I enlisted," George finally began, his voice steady but distant, as if he were recounting someone else's story. "Barely 18, thought I was invincible. They shipped me off to Vietnam in '68, said we were fighting for freedom, for democracy. I believed them." His eyes glazed over as he spoke, the memories clearly vivid despite the years that had passed. "The first time you see, well, you know," he paused, his jaw tightening. "You don't forget. Friends you trained with, laughed with, gone in an instant. And those medals?" He gestured toward the table with a bitter smile. "They give you those when you survive, but they don't tell you how to live with it afterward." Keanu felt his chest tighten. He could hear the pain woven into every word, a lifetime of loss and disillusionment packed into a few sentences. "When I came back," George continued, "the world had moved on. People called us names, spat at us. No parades, no thank you for your service, just silence. I tried to build a life, though. Got married, had a daughter, thought I'd left the war behind." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, passing it to Keanu. It showed a young woman with a bright smile, her arms wrapped around a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. "That's my Sarah and little Emily," George said, his voice softening. "They were my world." Keanu studied the photo, sensing the depth of love behind those words. But he also sensed what was coming next, the part of the story that explained why George was here, selling the pieces of his past. "Cancer took Sarah 10 years ago," George said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "And Emily, she was in a car accident 2 years later. Drunk driver didn't even stop." Keanu's heart clenched. He handed the photo back with a reverence that words couldn't capture. "I'm so sorry, George," he whispered. George shrugged, the kind of shrug that came from years of trying to carry an unbearable weight. "You get used to it, or at least you tell yourself you do." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Keanu felt a lump in his throat, not just from George's story, but from the realization of how invisible such pain could be. Here was a man who had given everything, his youth, his health, his family, and now sat at a flea market, forced to sell his memories to survive. "What about friends, family?" Keanu asked gently, hoping there was someone else in George's life. George shook his head slowly. "Most of the guys from my unit are gone. The few that are left, well, we don't talk much. Too many ghosts, you know? And as for family," he gave a humorless laugh, "I outlived them all. Just me and these medals now." Keanu swallowed hard. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to do. Buying the medals wasn't enough. It felt like putting a bandage on a wound that needed stitches. "You shouldn't have to sell these," Keanu finally said, his voice firm but kind. "They're a part of you, your history. They deserve to be honored." George looked at him, his eyes sharp despite their cloudiness. "Honor doesn't pay the bills, son," he said quietly. "I've got rent due, and my prescriptions cost more than my pension covers. Pride doesn't put food on the table." Keanu nodded, understanding more than George realized. He'd seen the cracks in society, the people who slipped through them unnoticed, but this time it felt personal. This wasn't just about George. It was about all the men and women like him, forgotten heroes who had sacrificed everything and been left behind. As Keanu stood there, the sun climbing higher in the sky, an idea began to take shape in his mind. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And what he was about to do next would not only change George's life, but shine a light on the countless others who shared his struggle. Keanu stood there, his mind racing as George's words echoed in his ears. The sounds of the bustling market faded into a distant hum, overshadowed by the weight of the old man's story. This wasn't just about one veteran selling his medals. This was a reflection of a larger, heartbreaking reality. How many other men like George were out there, their sacrifices forgotten, their stories untold? Keanu reached into his wallet, pulling out several crisp bills. He placed them gently on the table, more than enough to cover the medals, but George didn't even flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if the act of selling these pieces of his past had drained him of any emotion left to show. "These aren't just things, George," Keanu said quietly. "They're part of your life. You shouldn't have to give them up." George finally looked up, his tired eyes locking onto Keanu's. There was a flicker of gratitude, but it was buried beneath layers of pride and resignation. "Son, I appreciate it, but I've made my peace. A man's got to do what he can to get by." Keanu felt a surge of frustration, not at George, but at the system that had let him down. It wasn't right, it wasn't fair. But George wasn't asking for pity, he wasn't even asking for help. He was just surviving the only way he knew how. But Keanu couldn't walk away. Not this time. "Let me at least take you to lunch," Keanu offered, his voice gentle but firm. "You can tell me more about your story. I'd like to hear it." George hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not the kind that came without strings attached. But something in Keanu's demeanor, his sincerity, his quiet respect, made it hard to refuse. "All right," George finally muttered, slowly standing from his chair. "But I'm picking the place." Keanu chuckled softly. "Deal." They ended up at a small, unassuming diner a few blocks from the market. The kind of place with cracked leather booths, sticky tabletops, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. But the coffee was strong, and the waitress knew George by name, which told Keanu this wasn't his first time here. They sat in a corner booth, the late morning sun casting long shadows across the checkered floor. George ordered a black coffee and a simple plate of eggs and toast. Keanu followed suit, though his appetite was more out of politeness than hunger. As they waited for their food, George began to talk, not just about the war, but about the years that followed. The struggle to find steady work, the nights spent lying awake, haunted by memories he couldn't escape, the loneliness that crept in after losing his wife, the crushing grief when his daughter died. Each story painted a picture of a man who had given everything and received so little in return. Keanu listened intently, his heart aching with every word. He wanted to do more than just sit there. He wanted to fix it. But how do you fix a lifetime of pain? "I used to think there'd be something waiting for us when we got back," George said quietly, staring into his coffee cup like it held the answers. "A new life, a fresh start. But the world doesn't work that way. You come back and you're just another face in the crowd. Another body trying to survive." Keanu's jaw clenched. This wasn't just George's story. It was the story of countless veterans who had been discarded by the very country they had fought to protect. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone," Keanu said softly. "There's got to be something we can do." George snorted, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "We? "You're a good kid, but you don't owe me anything. No one does." But Keanu wasn't convinced. He felt a growing fire inside him, a need to not just help George, but to shine a light on this invisible crisis. When they finished their meal, Keanu insisted on paying, ignoring George's half-hearted protests. As they stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, Keanu turned to him. "George, I want you to keep those medals," he said firmly. "I'll cover whatever you need, rent, meds, whatever it takes. But those medals belong with you." George stared at him, stunned into silence. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse out of sheer, stubborn pride. But then, his shoulders sagged, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I don't know what to say," George murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied with a gentle smile. "But this isn't the end. I'm going to make sure people hear your story, and not just yours. Every veteran who's been left behind." George didn't respond, but the glimmer of hope in his eyes said more than words ever could. As Keanu watched the old man walk away, medals safely tucked back into his bag, he knew this was just the beginning. He had the platform, the resources, and now a mission. What he didn't know yet was how much of an impact his next steps would have, not just on George, but on the lives of countless veterans across the country. And the road ahead would be filled with unexpected challenges that would test not just his determination, but his very belief in the goodness of the world. The days following Keanu's encounter with George were anything but ordinary. What started as a personal mission to help one man soon blossomed into something far bigger, something Keanu hadn't fully anticipated. The story of the veteran selling his medals clung to Keanu's mind like a shadow, refusing to let him move on. But it wasn't just about George anymore. It was about the countless other veterans facing the same silent struggles, their sacrifices buried beneath years of neglect. Keanu decided to act. He reached out to a close friend, Maria Thompson, a journalist known for her work on social justice issues. They met in a quiet cafe in downtown Los Angeles, far from the prying eyes of Hollywood paparazzi. Maria listened intently as Keanu recounted George's story, her pen flying across the notebook in front of her. "This isn't just one man's story, Maria," Keanu said, his voice firm. "There are thousands like him. They served their country, and now they're left to fend for themselves. It's not right." Maria nodded, her eyes reflecting the same fire that burned in Keanu's chest. "If we can get the story out there, Keanu, people will listen, especially if it comes from you." Keanu shook his head. "It's not about me. It's about them. I want George's voice to be heard." Within days, Maria published an in-depth piece titled "The Forgotten Heroes Among Us." It featured George's story front and center, accompanied by powerful photos of his medals and the haunting image of him sitting alone at the flea market. But what really captured people's attention was Keanu's involvement. The article highlighted how he'd not only bought the medals, but also promised to support George and find ways to help veterans like him. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story went viral within hours. Social media exploded with shares, comments, and hashtags like "Honor Our Heroes" and "Keanu Cares." News outlets across the country picked it up, and soon Keanu found himself inundated with interview requests. But instead of focusing on himself, he redirected the spotlight back to the issue at hand. In one interview, sitting in a modest chair with his signature calm demeanor, Keanu spoke directly to the camera. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about George and the thousands of veterans who gave everything for their country and came home to nothing. We can't ignore this anymore." But not everyone was supportive. As the story gained traction, Keanu faced unexpected resistance from certain political groups and organizations. Some claimed he was exploiting veterans for publicity. Others accused him of painting an unfair picture of the government's support for veterans. Keanu, however, remained unfazed. One day, as he was leaving a meeting with a local veterans organization, Keanu's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mr. Reeves," the stern voice greeted him. "This is Congressman Richards. I've been following your efforts regarding veterans. While your intentions may be noble, I'd advise you to tread carefully. You're stirring up a lot of unnecessary noise." Keanu's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. If telling the truth is making noise, then maybe it's time people started listening. The line went dead, but Keanu felt the weight of the warning. He knew he was stepping into sensitive territory, challenging systems and institutions that preferred to keep such stories buried. But the faces of George and countless other veterans gave him the resolve to push forward. Determined to create lasting change, Keanu decided to establish the Valor Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting veterans in need. The foundation aimed to provide financial assistance, mental health resources, and job placement programs for veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The announcement of the foundation brought both praise and further scrutiny. Celebrities, fans, and everyday people rallied behind Keanu, donating generously and offering their support. But with the spotlight came increased pressure. Media outlets dug into Keanu's personal life, searching for any scandal or misstep they could exploit. One evening, after a long day of meetings and interviews, Keanu sat alone in his modest apartment, staring at the stack of letters on his coffee table. They were from veterans and their families, sharing their stories of hardship and gratitude. But there was one letter that stood out. It was from George. Keanu unfolded the paper, his heart pounding as he read the shaky handwriting. Dear Keanu, I don't have the words to thank you for what you've done. Not just for me, but for all of us who thought we were forgotten. I've started meeting with other vets in my neighborhood, and for the first time in years, I feel like I belong again. You gave me more than just my medals back. You gave me hope. Keep fighting the good fight. We're with you. Your friend, George. Keanu felt a lump rise in his throat. This was why he was doing it. For George. For every veteran who thought their sacrifices were invisible. But the fight was far from over. In the coming weeks, Keanu faced legal hurdles, threats from powerful figures, and personal attacks that tested his resolve. But with every obstacle, his determination only grew stronger. He wasn't just fighting for George anymore. He was fighting for justice, for recognition, and for a future where no veteran would ever have to sell their memories to survive. And little did he know, the biggest challenge and the most heartwarming triumph was yet to come. The buzz surrounding Keanu's mission only grew louder as weeks passed. The Valor Foundation was officially launched, its mission statement simple yet powerful. No hero left behind. Donations flooded in from across the globe, not just from fans or fellow actors, but from ordinary people moved by George's story. Veterans shared their own experiences online, creating a tapestry of voices that could no longer be ignored. But Keanu wasn't interested in just raising money. He wanted to make a statement, one that would resonate far beyond Hollywood headlines or viral articles. He envisioned an event, something tangible, something that would bring veterans together and shine a spotlight on their contributions and struggles. It would be more than just a fundraiser. It would be a celebration of resilience, a tribute to those who had given everything. The idea took shape quickly. A Veterans Honor Gala hosted in Los Angeles, with proceeds going directly to support housing, medical care, and mental health services for struggling veterans. Keanu called in favors from his network, directors, actors, musicians, and philanthropists, all eager to support the cause. But for Keanu, this wasn't about star power. It was about making sure veterans like George were front and center. Still, organizing the event was no easy task. Logistics piled up, and so did the challenges. Permits were delayed, sponsors hesitated, and behind the scenes, Keanu still felt the pushback from powerful figures uncomfortable with his growing influence in this space. But Keanu remained undeterred. The letters from veterans, like George's heartfelt note, sat on his desk, a constant reminder of why he was doing this. 2 weeks before the event, Keanu sat in a dimly lit meeting room with his small but dedicated team. The stress was palpable. Deadlines were tight, and despite the outpouring of public support, there were concerns about whether they could pull it off in time. "We're short on security," Maria, his journalist friend who had become an unofficial advisor, pointed out, scanning the latest checklist. "And we still haven't confirmed the venue's sound system." Keanu rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping in. "We'll figure it out. We have to." But what weighed on him most wasn't the logistics. It was making sure George would be there. He hadn't seen the old man in weeks. They'd exchanged a few phone calls, But George had been distant, almost reluctant to accept all the attention. Keanu worried that the man's pride might keep him from attending the event designed to honor him. That evening, Keanu decided to visit George in person. The apartment complex where George lived was modest, the kind of place that had seen better days. The paint on the walls was chipped, and the hallway lights flickered intermittently. Keanu knocked on George's door, waiting patiently until he heard the shuffle of footsteps from inside. When the door creaked open, George stood there, looking older than Keanu remembered. His eyes, however, still held that sharpness, that quiet resilience. "Keanu," George greeted, a mix of surprise and warmth in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to check in," Keanu replied with a gentle smile. "And I wanted to make sure you'll be at the gala," George sighed, stepping aside to let Keanu in. The apartment was small but neat. The medals Keanu had bought still sat on a shelf, carefully displayed next to the photo of George's wife and daughter. "I don't know, kid," George muttered, lowering himself into his recliner. "All this attention, it's a bit much for an old man like me." Keanu sat across from him, leaning forward. "It's not just about you, George. It's about every veteran who's been through what you've been through. You being there, it's going to mean a lot. To me, to them." George studied Keanu for a long moment, his weathered face softening. "You don't give up, do you?" Keanu chuckled. "Not when it matters." After a pause, George nodded slowly. "All right, but only if you promise one thing." "Hey, thing." "Don't make it about me," George said firmly. "Make it about all of us." Keanu reached over, gripping George's shoulder. "Deal." With George's promise secured, Keanu threw himself into the final preparations. The days blurred into nights, but the momentum was unstoppable. The venue, Ahilak Hall, overlooking downtown Los Angeles, was transformed with banners honoring veterans, displays of their photos and stories lining the walls. Keanu made sure George's medals were among them, alongside those of others who had reached out through the foundation. As the night of the gala approached, anticipation buzzed in the air. The city was watching, the world was watching, but for Keanu, it wasn't about the cameras or the red carpet. It was about making sure George and every veteran like him felt seen, honored, and, most importantly, never forgotten. The stage was set, but Keanu had one more surprise planned, one that would leave not a single dry eye in the room. The night of the Veterans Honor Gala arrived, and Los Angeles shimmered under the city lights. The grand hall, draped in deep navy and gold, was filled with an air of anticipation. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the crowd, but it wasn't the usual Hollywood glitz. Yes, there were celebrities, politicians, and media figures in attendance, but tonight, the real stars were the veterans. Keanu stood backstage, his heart pounding, not from nerves, but from the weight of what this night represented. Through the heavy curtains, he could see George sitting near the front, dressed in a simple suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. His medals, now polished to a brilliant shine, were pinned proudly to his chest. But George didn't look entirely comfortable. His eyes scanned the crowd, as if unsure whether he belonged in such a grand setting. Keanu took a deep breath. This is for him. For all of them. The lights dimmed and the murmurs in the room faded to a respectful hush. The MC, a well-known news anchor, stepped onto the stage and began the evening with a tribute to the sacrifices of veterans, highlighting the struggles many faced after returning home. As the speech concluded, the spotlight shifted, and Keanu was introduced. The applause was immediate and thunderous, but Keanu barely noticed. His focus was on George, whose eyes met his with a mixture of pride and humility. Keanu walked to the podium, his signature calm demeanor cloaking the storm of emotions brewing inside. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But this evening isn't about me, or anyone else on this stage. It's about the men and women who've given everything for their country, only to come home and find themselves forgotten." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I met a man recently, a veteran named George, who was selling his war medals at a flea market just to make ends meet. Those medals represented courage, sacrifice, and history. But to George, in that moment, They were just a means to survive. Keanu glanced at George, whose eyes glistened under the soft lights. George's story isn't unique. There are thousands of veterans like him struggling silently. That's why we created the Valor Foundation, to ensure that no hero is left behind. But tonight, I want to do something more personal. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift in his tone. Keanu reached behind the podium and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. He stepped away from the microphone and walked down the steps, the room falling into complete silence. Keanu approached George's table and, without a word, knelt in front of him. He opened the box, revealing a custom-made medal gleaming under the lights. It wasn't military issued, but its significance was undeniable. The inscription read, "For service beyond the battlefield, a hero among us. This belongs to you," Keanu said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for what you did in the war, but for surviving everything that came after. For showing us what resilience truly means." For a moment, George was frozen, his lips trembling as he stared at the medal. The room held its breath. Then, with shaky hands, George took the medal, his eyes welling with tears that finally spilled over. The crowd erupted into applause, loud, heartfelt, and sustained. But Keanu wasn't finished. He returned to the stage, his voice resonating with newfound intensity. "Tonight, we honor George, but tomorrow and every day after, we fight for every veteran who feels forgotten. This is just the beginning." As the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, Keanu looked out over the sea of faces. He saw tears, smiles, and, most importantly, hope. In that moment, he knew this wasn't just a gala, it was a movement, and it had only just begun. The Veterans Honor Gala marked a turning point not just for George, but for countless veterans across the country. The media coverage was overwhelming. Headlines the next morning read, "Keanu Reeves honors forgotten heroes," and "A night that changed lives." But beyond the glitz of celebrity involvement, something deeper had been ignited: awareness, empathy, and action. In the weeks following the event, the Valor Foundation experienced an outpouring of support. Donations flooded in from people around the world, some giving large sums, others contributing what little they could. More importantly, veterans who had felt invisible for years began to step forward, sharing their stories and finding a community that finally saw them. For George, life took a turn he never expected. One morning, a few days after the gala, Keanu visited George at his apartment, but this time, George wasn't there. Instead, he found a note taped to the door. "Gone fishing with the guys, be back later. Thanks for everything, kid." Keanu chuckled softly, folding the note into his pocket. George had reconnected with other veterans in his neighborhood, men he'd once served with, who had drifted apart over the years, but were now finding solace in each other's company. The quiet, lonely man Keanu met at the flea market was slowly transforming into someone surrounded by friendship and support. But Keanu's mission didn't end there. The foundation began partnering with local organizations to provide housing assistance, medical care, and counseling services for veterans in need. Job training programs were launched, and support groups were established across multiple cities. Keanu used his platform not just to raise money, but to lobby for legislative changes, pushing for increased support for veterans' benefits and mental health resources. The ripple effect was undeniable. Stories of veterans helped by the Valor Foundation began surfacing in the media, like Maria, a single mother and former Marine who found stable housing after years of struggling with PTSD, or Carlos, an Army veteran who landed a job as a mechanic through one of the Foundation's job placement programs. Each success story reinforced the Foundation's mission and inspired others to contribute or volunteer. But for Keanu, it wasn't about the headlines or recognition. It was about seeing lives changed, one person at a time. A few months later, Keanu received an invitation in the mail. Handwritten and simple. "Keanu, come join us at the community center this Saturday. The boys and I have something to show you." George, curious, Keanu arrived at the small neighborhood center that weekend. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by a room filled with veterans and their families. The walls were adorned with photos from their service days, but also new ones, of fishing trips, barbecues, and gatherings that spoke of friendship and healing. George stood at the front, his eyes bright and his posture proud. When he saw Keanu, he waved him over with a grin. "We've got something for you," George said, pulling Keanu toward a newly installed plaque on the wall. It read, "In honor of Keanu Reeves, for giving us back more than just our medals, for giving us back our dignity and hope." Keanu felt a lump rise in his throat. He turned to George, who simply nodded, as if to say, "This is where you belong too." As the room filled with laughter and stories, Keanu realized something profound. In trying to help George, he had found his own sense of purpose. This wasn't just about giving back, it was about building a future where no one, veteran or otherwise, would ever feel forgotten. And as he stood among friends, surrounded by the warmth of a community reborn, Keanu knew this was only the beginning of a lifelong mission. Months later, Keanu found himself back at the Rose Bowl flea market, the same place where it all began. The morning sun bathed the market in a familiar golden glow, but something felt different. As he wandered through the stalls, he noticed small but meaningful changes. Vendors chatting with elderly veterans, shoppers pausing to listen to their stories, and handmade signs reading, "Veterans Welcome, Heroes Among Us." Near the spot where George once sat, a group of young volunteers from the Valor Foundation helped a few older veterans set up tables, not to sell their memories, but to share them. Keanu smiled, his heart full. One simple act of compassion had blossomed into a movement, proving that even the smallest gesture could spark lasting change. As he turned to leave, Keanu caught sight of a young boy saluting an old veteran, who chuckled and returned the gesture. The future, Keanu realized, was already brighter. Sometimes all it takes is one person to remind the world to care.